I met Paul and said, do you want to join my band, you know? And then George joined. And then Ringo joined. We were just a band who made it very, very big, that's all.
Hello there, my name's Scott, and welcome to Dig a Podcast, a show in which I give you an in-depth story behind the songs sung by the best band there is, was, and ever will be, the Beatles. In this season, Season 2, we work our way through the album Meet the Beatles, or our UK listeners know it as With the Beatles. Meet the Beatles is the second Beatles album released in the United States. It was the first US Beatles album to be issued by Capitol Records on 20th January 1964 in both mono and stereo formats. It topped the popular album chart on the 15th of February 1964 and remained at number 1 for 11 weeks before being replaced by the Beatles' second album. The cover featured Robert Freeman's iconic portrait of the Beatles used in the UK for the With the Beatles, with a blue tint added to the original stark black and white photograph. Let's continue with the last track of Season 2, and also the last track on the Meet the Beatles LP.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Not a Second Time. Harmonic interest is typical of their quicker songs, and one gets the impression that they think simultaneously of a harmony and melody. So firmly are the major tonic sevenths and ninths built into their tunes, and the flat submediate key switches. So natural is the Aeolian cadence at the end of Not a Second Time, the chord progression which ends Mahler's Song of the Earth. This is a quote from William Mann, the then music critic of the Times in London. The article titled What Songs the Beatles Sang was printed on December 23rd, 1963, just over a month after the release of the album With the Beatles in Great Britain. This critical analysis was unlike any media exposure the Beatles were getting up to this time, most of which consisted of reports of the mass hysteria that accompanied their appearances. What this article did was add an enormous amount of credibility to the Beatles' music. It helped to squelch the complaints from parents that their teenagers were idolizing long-haired, talentless noisemakers. John Lennon referred to this article in interviews many times over the years, emphasizing that this review was responsible for starting the whole intellectual bit about the Beatles. The term Aeolian cadence became an often mentioned term in the tabloid press at the time, which sounded very impressive with respect to the Beatles' music, but was viewed as humorous by the band. I can't help having a quiet giggle when straight-faced critics start feeding all sorts of hidden meanings into the stuff we write, Lennon remarked in 1965. William Mann wrote the intellectual article about the Beatles. He used a whole lot of musical terminology, and he's a twit. In the 1970s, John seemed to change his attitude about his review. I still don't know what he means at the end, but he made us acceptable to the intellectuals. It worked, and we were flattered. I wrote Not a Second Time, and really, it was just chords like any other chords. McCartney agreed, saying we hadn't been conscious of any of that. We just did our songs in hotel rooms whenever we had spare moment, John and I sitting on twin beds with guitars. Instinct is what propelled Lennon and McCartney to write what they did over the years, being that they had no formal musical training. They wrote by feel, which Lennon testified to in 1973. Intellectuals have the problems of having to understand it. They can't feel anything. The only way to get an intellectual is to speak to him and then play him the record. You couldn't put a record on and just let them hear it. The effect of William Mann's review had such a lasting impact that the subject was still raised in a 1980 interview shortly before John's death. His last words on the subject of Aeolian cadences were, "To this day, I don't have any idea what they are. They sound like exotic birds." Songwriting history. It has been confirmed by both Lennon and McCartney that Not a Second Time was written entirely by John. Both of them also confirmed in interviews that John was influenced by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles for the song. This can clearly be detected in the melody Lennon wrote, as well as the "trapped in a controlling relationship" lyrics, as evidenced in "You've Really Got a Hold on Me," which is also recorded by the Beatles for the same British album. It could be presumed by listening to the finished product that the song was written shortly before being recorded. It appears that John is the only Beatle that is fully acquainted with the song, as Paul and George's part are faintly heard and rudimentary. No vocal harmonies are heard in the song, although they could have been utilised to great effect. George Martin can easily be recognised as contributing the bulk of the musicianship to the song, as his piano parts dominate throughout. Although no records or interviews exist that detail when the song was written, it can be assumed that the song was composed sometime in early September of 1963. Recording history. Both afternoon and evening sessions were scheduled in EMI Studio 2 on September 11th, 1963. The evening session ran from 7 to 10:15 p.m, which began with the Beatles introducing and completing the entire song. 5 takes were made of the basic track, which consisted of John singing and all 4 Beatles playing live. Take 5 was deemed the best, ready for overdubs. It has been suggested by some sources that McCartney did not participate in the song at all, since the piano part, which was overdubbed afterwards by George Martin, focused on the bass notes of the song. The same has been said about George Harrison's contribution, since only one guitar can easily be heard. We do know with certainty that both McCartney and Harrison were present earlier this day for the recording of All I've Got to Do, in which their contributions can be easily heard. Surely Harrison would also have been present for the evening session, since his first composition, Don't Bother Me, was premiered that day. Evidence suggests, therefore, that these 5 takes of the basic track were recorded by all 4 Beatles. The song then continued through takes 6 through 9, first for double-tracking John's vocals, and second for overdubbing George Martin's piano work. The piano solo was no doubt overdubbed separately, which made it take 9 the keeper. All of this took place between the estimated time of 7 and 8:30 p.m. The mono mix of the song was made from take 9 on September 30th, along with 4 other tracks for the album. This mix was performed by George Martin with engineers Norman Smith and Jeff Emmerich. The stereo mix was performed quickly, along with the rest of the entire album, on October 29th by George Martin, Smith, Emmerich, and BT. The fade-out of the songs were each performed at their respective mixing sessions. Thanks for listening to Dig a Podcast. You can subscribe to our podcast on Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. This has been a Team Wilco production. Until next time, if you know what I mean. Do I did? No? Okay.